She had learned to keep the small things secret first. The shape of a laugh hidden under a hand, the way the house smelled of lemon oil when she stayed up late polishing, the habit of tucking a stray curl behind her ear while she watched a child sleep. Secrets lived on the edge of routines until they became the routines, and Elena had become very good at living on edges. 4 years had folded themselves into one another since Marco left. 4 years since the rented flat on Via Tasso had emptied overnight. Since the note had been as cold and exact as a business card. I am leaving, for both our sakes. No apology, no backward glance. Elena had read and reread those words in the kitchen until they blurred, until the spaces between letters looked like small caves to crawl into. She'd rung his phone until it went to voicemail. Then she'd rung the number of the bar where he worked. Then she'd written that voicemail message into the bottom drawer where socks lost their partners. Life, she discovered, was what you stitched into that drawer. She kept what mattered most underneath daily life, like a seed pressed between pages. Sophia, too, when the door had shut, a wordless bundle, a fist that clung to her mother's collar, a child with her father's mouth. Elena told herself she would raise Sophia quietly, far from the orbit of the man who had walked away. She turned down invitations, changed her schedule, took jobs that aligned with the rhythm of school pickup and nap times. When Sophia learned to walk, Elena learned to move like someone rearranging the furniture of a life around a new center. The town was the kind that knew small things, who had let a rose die, whose cat had kittens under a porch, which families argued about the wrong color for the shutters. But secrets like Elena's lived in the cracks. People assumed things, that Marco had found a different life, a different wife, a different reason to be elsewhere. Elena did not correct them. It was easier to let gossip invent a neat narrative than to answer questions with the messy truth. When friends murmured sympathy and the village tilted its head at her single status, Elena only smiled and said, with the practiced lightness of someone who had learned to pass winter without complaint, "We're fine." She told Sophia that her father liked to travel. She told Sophia he had gone to faraway cities and would come back when he could. It was a fib that lay flat and comfortable in a child's head. Children will fashion myths to fill the empty spaces adults leave, and Sophia's myth was a man who sent postcards written in a small, messy script that Elena never allowed herself to read. On the morning the first piece of real news arrived, Elena was at the market choosing oranges. It was just a piece of paper, folded in the bottom of a newspaper left on a bench, a photograph and a name printed in an official font. Marco Vitale. The face in the photo was the same as the one she had loved, the same serif of jaw, the same small scar on the cheek from which she once snorted in amusement. But the eyes had different weather. They were colder, organized into an expression that fit worse with the memory of him teaching Sophia to stack blocks. The caption under the photograph used words Elena had not expected to read together. Don Marco Vitale, arrested in international narcotics sting. The article described raids in other cities, a trail of businesses and shell accounts. The man she had once argued with over the placement of a lamp was a name in a case file now. When she folded the paper back into itself, she felt the sudden ridiculous need to shadow its lines with her thumb, as if rubbing might erase the bold headlines. Sophia, who had come along for the errand and sat in the stroller munching on a cracker, looked up at Elena with trust like sunlight. Elena put the paper into her pocket and went home with her oranges. That night she dreamed of doors, doors opening to reveal crowds, doors swinging closed on corridors of money, doors that were nailed shut in a hurry. When she woke, she was certain of this. The world had tilted by a degree she couldn't measure. Secrets, she had always believed, were her own business, But once someone else's name appeared in public, once a photograph could be tagged and shared and reverberated into the long hall of the internet, there was no longer only one person's secret to guard. The village buzzed in little rings. People debated whether they had recognized Marco in the papers. Old acquaintances speculated whether he had been involved in anything more than a bad business deal. Elena avoided the Rovers for a week because the pub's windows filled with men who would grind their teeth through something they called pride and knowledge. She thought she could manage the new knowledge quietly, file it like a receipt, and not let it burn a hole through her day. But on the second Tuesday after the article, she saw him. He appeared at the end of the lane like a stopped clock set wrongly into motion. She was dropping off Sophia at kindergarten when a car she did not know idled by the pavement, and the back door opened. Elena saw the light catch on a profile she had not meant to catalog anymore. People around them moved like extras in a badly rehearsed play. Heads turned, whispers surfed outward. Elastic shock passed through her body. For a moment she thought she might be dreaming. Then the car door shut, and Marco walked. He did not come straight to them. He seemed to test places, the curb, a lamppost, the path to the gate. When he finally met our eyes, the street felt too small for the distance between the two of them. Time did an odd thing, folding into itself like so much paper. He looked older, as if the economy of years had been spent on a different kind of work, but the line of his mouth when he tried to smile was painfully familiar. "Elena," he said, and the syllable landed like a hand at the base of his skull. He turned his face. It was older, yes, but it was also him. His voice had the memory of theirs, an accent they had both shared when they had declared amateur love. She kept Sophia's small hand in hers so she would not do anything before she considered it. She watched Marco watch the child, a small contraction behind his eyes that was almost a tremor of something that could pass for regret. "Elena," he said it again, as if needing to practice getting to the important syllable without tripping on the earlier ones. "I don't," she said, because if she didn't stop him, he would speak the kind of words that fit neatly into his absence. "I'm sorry. I had to. It wasn't you." She wanted none of them. That morning she could not afford the thing that had once undone her, pity for the man who had chosen his path. Marco blinked. For a moment he was the old habitual man who had a cigarette pressed between two fingers and a plan in his pocket. He stepped closer, the smell of cologne and something metallic riding on him. The crowd shifted like a tide. Elena felt the hair move at the back of her neck as if some small animal had detected danger. She did not know the sound that suddenly rose out of the street was a camera's shutter, but one of the village teenagers had already begun posting videos. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that," Marco said. He did not lift his voice. It was closer to a confession behind another door. "I left to protect you both." The word protect, when it came from him, had the odd, jagged shape of irony. Elena had curled herself around Sophia to protect her, had said no to nights out and to friends who wanted to know why she had lost her old laugh. Would he stand on that defense? Elena had been his refuge once. He had left and then sent back the scent of his absence. "You left," she said. "You left a note." "I know." He looked past her at Sophia, who had found a small prickly leaf and was intently studying it. "There are things you don't know, things I had to handle. You never told me." The accusation was a stone she had polished in her hand. "You never asked if I needed to know." "I couldn't." He inhaled, as if some memory had lodged in his throat. "If they knew who we were, they would have taken you, taken her." "Them," Elena said. "Is that who you work for now?" He flinched. For a brief sliver of a second, his face closed. I'm not what the paper says," he said. "Not like that."
Elena had not believed a word he'd say since the ring of his absence had stopped echoing against the walls. But the world was not a theater where people played to type. She decided then she would listen without walking straight into either forgiveness or fight. She would learn the rhythm of his voice and see what it contained. Marco told her in stops and starts. He told her about debt that was more than money, debts traded like currency, promises exchanged with the kind of men who sank anchors into your chest. He told her about an envelope given and an envelope gone missing, about a night of threats and the suddenness with which people decide to rearrange lives. He told her the name, Don Vitali, in a whisper that wanted to be a confession and a warning both. He told her he'd been foolish, young, and then pushed into a role by forces he had not had the tools to resist. "You could have come back to me," Elena said. "He had to make sure those people were gone first," he said. The words were blunt and ragged. "That's the truth." Elena wanted to throw the newspaper into his face. She wanted to tell him that the truth had another shape, the one that sat at home each evening when the kettle boiled and the child practiced saying her name. But she also wanted to hear more. If there was danger, it did not care about the neat lines of their history. Sophia had to be safe, and the measure of safety was not only absence of threat, but the presence of plan. "They'll come looking for blood, for retribution, for debts unpaid. We've been fine for 4 years." Elena's voice had the brittle tone of someone asking for proof in a court that did not exist. She wanted to believe the safety they had cobbled together was imagined. "That's because I kept my distance," Marco said, "and because I thought I could fix it without dragging you into it." "You decided to disappear?" Elena's eyes narrowed. "You decided we deserved that?" Their argument did not resolve. It never does when the spaces between words are full of history. Marco's plea sat like a bruise when he asked to see Sophia. Elena allowed it once, then twice. Each time he left, he looked older, the pattern of living and surviving etching new lines into his face. He came back in small ways, a note slipped into a library book, a coin left in a jar with a careful handwriting, for Sophia. He tried to stay at the edges, and she let him because there was no neatly packaged answer to the force that had taken him. But then, like spring thunder, the danger crested. Someone scraped at their door one night that did not feel accidental. Elena woke to the sound, heart battering at her ribs. She rose, cupped Sophia's small face in her hands, and walked to the window. 2 men, not from their village, stood on the path with faces like shadows. They did not speak. They carried presence like a weapon.
Elena reached for the phone and found it thicker with sweat than useful with digits. She dialed Marco, breathed into the phone until he answered. When he heard, his answer came immediate and sharp. "Go to Aunt Maria's in the hills," he said. "Don't come back until I call." "It's our home," she said. "I can't." "Go," he said. It was the sort of order that left no time for argument. Elena wrapped Sophia in a coat, put a small satchel in her hand, and in the dark drove with a seatbelt of fury that would not allow her to cry. The men at the door stood unchanged. As she drove past the lane, they watched her leave and then moved toward her emptied home as if drawn to a scent. The hills were thin and the road bends were tight. Elena drove miles with her heart saved into clenched teeth. At Aunt Maria's, she found both safety and a new space of things. A pantry kept over generations, old rugs, and a woman whose hands had always known how to calm children. "You look like you're carrying winter," Maria said, and handed her a cup of tea like a miracle. Marco found them by dawn. He came alone, and when he stepped into Aunt Maria's small kitchen, he was not a don nor a man with a public name. He was, for a moment, only Elena's old habit. He crouched by Sophia, who blinked at him with sleep still clinged to her lashes. He spoke to her as if she were both treasure and territory. "Ciao, Sophia. I'm Marco." The child, who had been clumsy with the idea of a father, accepted him like sunlight. It was a small violence against Elena's hard-earned self-sufficiency. Yet, when she watched him with the child, she felt something she had thought buried, the outline of a man who could be kind, who could be patient, who might still learn to stand without being pulled along by old debts. But debts are not considerate of new possibilities. The men at the door had not been ordinary thugs. They belonged to a network whose tendrils reached for old favors and for the names of those who had, once, chosen them. They had been looking for Marco. He had tried to cut ties. They had not allowed it. A cousin of his arrived at the house that week with an invitation that was almost a command, an offer to broker a deal that would neutralize the threat. Neutralize the threat, he said, as if it were a noun you could buy at market. Marco listened, and then he declined. He would not barter away his child's life for the sake of an old ledger. In refusing, he stepped into a worse kind of danger, because the men whose business it was to collect would not see refusal as a refusal of obligation. They would see it as an affront. The day the car came for him, it was raining hard, and the lanes for the hills were slick. Elena had wanted to be there. She had planned to throw herself between the car and the road as a stunt anyone reading a novel might applaud. Instead, she watched from the kitchen window as Marco walked to the car, hands in his pockets like a man resigned to something he could not control. He turned to look at them, at Sophia waving too high from Aunt Maria's stoop, at Elena who felt hollow with fear, and his face arranged itself into an expression she would never forget. He climbed in, and the car drove into the rain. They received a call later. A voice without warmth said the words that freeze blood. "We have him. If he wants to live, tell us where the money is. If you don't cooperate, so be it." Elena set the phone down and felt the room tilt. She thought of the inboxes she had ignored, of the neat ways the town misread her absence, and of the small items of his left behind in drawers that smelled forever like him. These were the currencies of a life better unspent. She swallowed panic and instead did what she knew to do. She called people, Maria for a safe roof, friends who could lend presents, even a lawyer who smelled faintly of civics and coffee. It was then that the truth of Marco's transformation, if transformation it had been, began to reveal itself beyond the tabloids. In whispered phone calls with people from his past, Marco's life wrenched into view not as that of a resurrected criminal mastermind, but as someone who had been forced to juggle impossible choices. He had been made to wear titles like suits until he became the title. He had been dealt certain decks and had to play them. He had left, he said, because he thought removing himself would remove the stake that kept threats anchored to his door. It had not worked. "We are not a man with a gun," Marco said in a conversation with Elena in which every word was a small testament. "I will do anything to keep you and Sophia safe. I will fix this." "How?" she asked. "How do you fix the people who had preferred violence to negotiation? How do you fix a network that traded in fear like currency?" "You let me try," he said. She wanted to laugh at the simplicity, but he had stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain, and there was an earnestness she could not flinch from. She let him. What followed was a long braid of plans that were both practical and dangerous. Marco used what knowledge he had of the old networks to trap them into exposing themselves. He set up meetings in places they would expect to find him, only to be met with absence. He sent couriers with false ledgers and met with men who thought themselves clever. Elena watched from the periphery, half horrified and half in awe of the particular criminal competence he displayed, of a man who could command attention, yet whose hands shook when he thought of Sophia's small mouth forming his name. But there was a cost to all of this. The more Marco tried to outwit them, the more the men seemed to know where to reach. A car was burned outside Aunt Maria's house, so close that soot grimed the doorway. A note was left at their gate with the simple words, "Stay out of this." It was an explicit invitation to terror. "Get out," Marco urged one night, loud enough that the neighbors could hear. "Leave with Sophia. Go somewhere far. Don't wait for me." Elena felt betrayal inside the command. "You left once," she said. "I cannot do that again." "You could," he said. "I messed up, but I can make this right." They moved Sophia again and again, like nesting dolls of safety. They passed her between relatives with covers over chairs and with promises that sometimes felt thin as tissue. Elena learned in those days that courage is sometimes a ledger of small, repeated acts. Holding a child while the wind argues at the windows, answering the phone with a voice that does not reveal panic, cooking soup and serving it with the normalcy of someone in a role by rote. One night, Marco did not return. Week after week, they received no word. Elena bit down on the ache and kept moving through days like a woman assembling a bridge out of breadboards. She did what she could to distract Sophia. They went to the park and fed pigeons, and Elena taught Sophia to tie shoelaces in loops like little hearts. She told stories that were, as always, half truth and half comfort. Then, late on a Sunday, the house rang with the noise of a car like a drumbeat beating the air thin. The door swung, and there he was, not in a car, but at the foot of the stairs, hair wet and cut in a different style. He walked like a man who had been on glass and had not cut his soles. "Elena," he said, and the small syllable sounded like a bell. She wanted to ask everything first. She wanted to demand reasons and accountability, but there was one question that came before them all, the narrow one that stretched wider than all the others. "Is he safe?" "Yes," he said, "for now." He had arranged things the old way and the new. He had made alliances with people who spoke less of violence and more of leverage. He had used money he said he had not mentioned before, funds he had circumvented from old accounts he had once thought could be destroyed with absence. He did not tell her everything. There were things he could not disclose. There were men he could not name. He would not be able to erase 4 years with an apology. In the months that followed, the tension eased as if it were a muscle loosening under measured massage. Marco moved back with them tentatively, like someone tiptoeing into a room that might still be haunted. He attended parent-teacher evenings and learned to fold Sophia's face into kisses without watching his back. The village watched with the mixture of suspicion and curiosity it reserves for sagas. People had opinions. Some said Elena was foolish. Others believed in second chances because they had only seen the scratch of newspaper headlines and not the hollow of the nights she had kept. There were trials that attested to the difference between a life mended and a life whole. Trust did not return at once. There were furious arguments, nights when Elena could not sleep because she imagined the men who had once wanted Marco's blood hovering at the corners of their property, conversations with lawyers, threats that remained unspoken. But there were also mornings when Sophia would run into Marco's arms without pause, and he would catch her like a man catching dawn. Marco tried to be better in ways that were ordinary and radical. He took a job at the market helping an old fishmonger. He learned to make pancakes. He joined a community committee that planted saplings. He gave up certain practices and rituals of his old life and insisted that the money he used for their rent was clean. Elena watched with slow astonishment as the man who had once been a rumor on the edge of newspapers became an ordinary actor in a village's domestic theater. It did not free him of all shadows, but it altered their edges. Then, one winter, when the snow lay like a blanket over the lane and the village looked like a map of softened edges, something happened that made the whole history of the last 4 years seem like a drawing finally inked. A rival, a man who had once collected debts and had been thwarted by Marco's machinations, appeared at the market with a friend who carried grudges like gifts. The air in the stalls tightened. Elena watched as the man saw Marco across the stalls. He did not approach with a handshake. His face was a map of old business. Words passed between them like stones. The rival called Marco out with cheap slurs that tried to drag him back to a past he had tried to bury. Marco did not respond at first. He stood with his shoulders like a man bracing for impact. Then, in a moment that felt as if a tide had turned, the rival made a move that would have been dangerous in any other setting. He swung a hand meant to strike Marco. It missed, and then the market erupted into a fight that was messy and paid for in bruises and broken fruit. When it was over, and the rival was carted off by men who had no time for public disorder, something strange and tender happened. The people who had once whispered now stepped forward with small offers, a casserole, an extra blanket, a kindness that could not undo the hurt, but could, in a small way, mend the stitches. Marco sat with Elena later by the stove, warm hands cupped around his mug. His face was raw and yet certain in an everyday way. "I'll always have ghosts," he said, "but I'm here. I'm not leaving again." Elena let herself lean into him then, into the flawed geometry of a life that had known fear and had come, slow as molasses, to measure out hope. Sophia ran into the room and flung herself into both their laps, arms that did not understand the architecture of adult mistakes.
Moment, their three bodies arranged into a small, imperfect map of family. Not untroubled, not whole, but present, which sometimes is the only meaning worth making. Years later, people would remember the story in fragments, the newspaper photos that had announced a name like Doom, the nights at Aunt Maria's where napkins were folded into packets of emergency, the way a child bridged gaps it had no business attempting. They would tell the tale with differing emphases. Some would call Marco a reformed man. Others would call him a survivor of a system that uses people and throws them away. Elena would keep, privately, a ledger of small decisions that had saved them. The choice to leave at the first scrape, the refusal to let gossip decide their story, the habit of teaching Sophia the weeks when silence is dangerous and when it is wise. As for Sophia, she grew up with two people who had been shaped by absence and the work of repair. She learned to tie shoelaces and to recognize the smell of rain before thunder. She learned that names can be both maps and masks, and that sometimes the most heroic acts are the patient kinds, showing up to school assemblies, making a soup when neighbors fall ill, and learning when to call for help. The real twist of their story was not the arrival of a man with the name of a boss and the clatter of public scandal. It was the softer, harder change, that a child had been kept safe in the face of a storm, that love had been tested and had been not necessarily triumphant, but enduring enough to make daily life bearable. They had lost years to fear, yes, but they had reclaimed an ordinary kind of peace by the force of intention and the stubbornness of love. On a quiet evening, years after the first article, Elena found the old folded newspaper in the bottom drawer where socks lost their partners. She looked at the photograph of the man who had once been more rumor than guest in her life, and then across to a sleeping child in the other room. Elena smiled a small, private smile. Pieces of her life had been rearranged by forces beyond her control, by choices people had made, and by the hard arithmetic of danger. But in the middle of it all, she had made a decision again and again to protect, to stay, to teach a child that safety could be built and rebuilt. She set the paper aside, closed the drawer, and in the next room listened to the slow, regular breath of a child who carried in her small body the success of all those private defenses. Secrets had kept them safe. Honesty had begun to keep them freer. The path had been dangerous and wound through things that were not always pretty, but it had led to a place where a man who had once been a headline could look at his family and know what mattered most. When Marco told Sophia one spring afternoon that he had once been called a Don, she laughed because it sounded like a play title.
He explained, in the simpler words adults sometimes use for children, that people sometimes must change the stories they were born into. Sophia's face, earnest and sure, asked the question everyone once asked, "Did you change because of me?" Marco looked at Elena, at the child who had been both forecast and surprise, and then at the window where the village hummed on. "Yes," he said, not a promise forged in dramatic flair, but a settled answer that carried the small truth the rest of them had been building toward. He had chosen differently. It had taken danger and shame and enormous tension, but he had stepped into the ordinary work of being present. The rest of their days were not free of trouble. There were letters that arrived with old signatures, an occasional stranger who smelled faintly of smoke and of other people's pasts. But those things became part of the contours rather than the architecture of life. Elena learned how to lock doors not out of fear, but out of prudence. Marco learned to make apologies that were not excuses. Sophia grew up with the practical knowledge that life sometimes demands courage and often rewards quiet constancy. So the story that began with a secret child and a broken love yielded, in the end, a quieter twist than the tabloids could have promised. Not the rise of a man labeled as a boss, nor a melodrama resolved by violence, but the slow, patient unmaking of old debts and the remaking of a family on terms decided by their own bravery. It was a complicated ending, neither pristine nor perfect, but it was theirs. Stubborn, human, and ultimately something like a home.